The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floor of the penthouse as David Wellington crumpled up another resignation letter. His hands shook slightly as he read the words that had become all too familiar over the past 6 months. "I cannot continue working with your children," the letter began. "Despite my 15 years of experience with difficult cases, I find myself unable to manage their behavior." David let out a long sigh and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. 43 floors below, people hurried along, the sidewalks like tiny ants, completely unaware of the chaos happening in his $1,000,000 apartment. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass and tried to remember when his life had become so complicated. 2 years ago, everything had been different. His company was thriving, his wife Elena was alive, and his 8-year-old twins, Sophie and Alex, were normal, happy children. Now, at 35, he felt like he was drowning in a sea of problems he couldn't solve with money or business strategies. The sound of breaking glass from the kitchen snapped him back to reality. David rushed toward the noise, already knowing what he would find. Sophie stood in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by the remains of what used to be his favorite coffee mug. Her long brown hair hung in front of her face, but he could see the defiant glint in her green eyes. "It was an accident?" she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Where's Mrs. Patterson?" David asked, referring to the nanny who had just quit. "She left." Alex appeared from behind the kitchen island, his matching green eyes dancing with mischief. "She said we were impossible and that she never wanted to see us again." David felt his heart sink. Mrs. Patterson had come with glowing recommendations. She had handled celebrity children, diplomats' kids, even worked for a royal family in Europe. If she couldn't manage his twins, who could? She also said some bad words, Sophie added helpfully. Really bad ones. "Should I tell you what they were?" "No, that's okay." David rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. "Go get ready for school. I'll drive you today." The twins exchanged a look that David had seen many times before. It was the look that said they had won another battle in their ongoing war against anyone who tried to take care of them. As they walked away, David surveyed the damage in the kitchen. Besides the broken mug, there was what looked like cereal stuck to the ceiling, orange juice spilled across the counter, and somehow, inexplicably, there were muddy footprints on the white cabinets 8 feet off the ground. This wasn't just typical child misbehavior. This was calculated destruction, planned and executed with military precision. His children had become experts at psychological warfare, and their target was anyone brave enough to try to care for them. The ride to their private school was quiet, which should have been a relief, but somehow made David more nervous. Sophie sat behind him, methodically tearing paper into tiny pieces and letting them flutter onto the car's leather seats. Alex stared out the window, occasionally making soft, clicking sounds with his tongue that he knew annoyed his father. "You know," David said, trying to keep his voice casual, "Mrs. Patterson really wasn't that bad. She made those pancakes you liked on Saturday." "They tasted like cardboard," Sophie replied without looking up from her paper shredding. "And she smelled like old flowers," Alex added. "Not good flowers. Dead ones." David parked in front of the school and watched as other parents hugged their children goodbye. Some kids ran excitedly toward the building, backpacks bouncing. Others walked calmly with friends, chatting about homework or weekend plans. His children sat motionless in the back seat. "Have a good day," he said, the same words he said every morning. "We will," Sophie replied, though something in her voice made David's stomach clench. He waited until they disappeared into the building before pulling out his phone. The number for the nanny agency was already programmed into his contacts, right between his lawyer and his accountant, both numbers he'd been calling far too often lately. "Wellington residence needs," the receptionist answered before he could even speak. "Let me guess. Another resignation?" "The seventh one," David confirmed, hating how familiar this conversation had become. "Mr. Wellington, I need to be honest with you." The woman's voice carried a tone he'd never heard before. "We're running out of candidates willing to work with your family. Word travels fast in this industry, and your children have developed quite a reputation." David felt his face flush with embarrassment. "They're just going through a difficult time. Their mother died 2 years ago, and they're still adjusting." "I understand that, sir, and I'm very sorry for your loss. But our caregivers are professionals, not therapists. What your children did to Mrs. Chen last month—" David winced, remembering the incident. The twins had somehow managed to short-circuit the apartment's smart home system, causing all the lights to strobe while playing death metal at maximum volume. Mrs. Chen had been found in the bathroom, rocking back and forth and muttering in Mandarin. "That was just a prank that got out of hand," David said weakly. "Mr. Wellington, they reprogrammed your home's AI to respond only to curse words. Mrs. Chen couldn't turn on a single light switch without swearing. She's a 60-year-old grandmother who'd never said anything stronger than darn in her entire life." The silence stretched between them. David knew she was right, but admitting it felt like admitting he'd failed as a father. "We have one more candidate," the woman finally said. "But she's not from our usual pool. She's been doing housekeeping and occasional childcare through a smaller agency. Her rates are much lower than what you're used to paying." "I don't care about the money," David said quickly. "Can she start today? I have a flight to Tokyo tomorrow morning for a crucial business meeting. I'll call her and see. But Mr. Wellington, if this doesn't work out, I'm afraid we'll have to close your file. We simply cannot continue putting our staff through this." After hanging up, David sat in his car outside the school for 20 minutes, watching other parents come and go. They all looked so normal, so confident in their parenting abilities. He wondered if any of them had ever felt as lost as he did right now. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Board meeting moved to 3 p.m. Also, Alex's teacher called." He glued his math worksheet to his desk again. David started the car and headed toward his office, trying to push away the familiar feeling of dread that had become his constant companion. At work, he was respected and successful. He could negotiate million-dollar deals, manage hundreds of employees, and make decisions that affected thousands of people. But when it came to his own children, he felt completely powerless. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd built his fortune creating software that helped families communicate better, yet he couldn't have a normal conversation with his own kids without it ending in tears or destruction. By the time he reached his office, on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in Manhattan, David had received 3 more calls about his children's behavior at school. Sophie had convinced her entire art class that paint was actually edible, leading to 6 children with green tongues and 1 trip to the school nurse. Alex had somehow hacked into the school's PA system and played whale sounds during the morning. "Announcements. Maybe boarding school," his assistant suggested after relaying the latest incidents. "I hear there are some very good ones in Switzerland." David shook his head. He'd already failed his children by emotionally retreating after Elena's death. Sending them away would just confirm their worst fears about being abandoned and unloved. The truth was, he knew exactly why his children were acting out. They were angry, hurt, and scared. Elena had been the heart of their family, the one who remembered bedtime stories, kissed scraped knees, and somehow always knew the right thing to say. When she died in that car accident, she'd taken with her all the warmth and joy that had made their house a home. David had tried to fill that void with money and hired help, but 8-year-olds don't want expensive toys or fancy nannies. They want their parents to actually see them, to understand their pain, and to love them despite their flaws. The problem was, David didn't know how to do any of those things anymore. Grief had built walls around his heart, and work had become his escape from the overwhelming responsibility of raising 2 children who reminded him every day of everything he'd lost. As he stared out at the city skyline, David realized that tomorrow's trip to Tokyo might be the breaking point. If this new caregiver quit like all the others, he would officially be out of options. And for the first time since Elena's death, he wasn't sure money could solve his problems. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and Grace Johnson stepped into the marble lobby of the most expensive building she'd ever entered. She clutched her worn leather purse a little tighter and smoothed down her simple navy dress. The doorman had already called upstairs twice to confirm she was expected, looking at her like she might be lost. Grace wasn't lost. She was exactly where she needed to be, even if this place felt like stepping into a different world. The lobby had real flowers that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and the ceiling was so high it made her neck hurt to look up at it. At 45, Grace had cleaned a lot of houses and watched a lot of children, but nothing quite like this. When the agency called that morning asking if she could handle an emergency placement, she'd almost said no. Rich families usually wanted someone who looked the part, someone who could blend into their fancy lifestyle. Grace knew she wasn't that person, but then they mentioned the pay, and Grace thought about her own 3 kids at home. Her youngest, Tommy, needed new shoes for school, and her oldest daughter, Maya, was saving every penny for college. Sometimes you take opportunities not because they're easy, but because they're necessary. The elevator ride to the 43rd floor felt endless. Grace checked her reflection in the polished walls and tried to calm her nerves. She'd raised 4 children of her own after her husband died, worked double shifts as a nurse's aide, and managed to keep her family together when everything felt like it was falling apart. She could handle 2 8-year-olds no matter how rich their daddy was. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, which made Grace's eyes widen despite herself. She'd seen fancy houses in magazines, but this was something else entirely. The living room was bigger than her entire apartment, with windows that showed the whole city spread out like a picture book. David Wellington appeared from around a corner, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly as he spoke. "No, I need those contracts signed before I land in Tokyo," he was saying. "I don't care if it's midnight there. Wake someone up." He noticed Grace and held up one finger, continuing his conversation while looking her up and down like he was evaluating a piece of furniture. Grace had seen that look before from wealthy clients. It was the look that said, "You'll do, I guess." After 5 more minutes of business talk, David finally ended his call and turned to Grace with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Johnson, thank you for coming on such short notice. I assume the agency explained the situation?" "They said you needed someone to watch your twins while you travel," Grace replied, keeping her voice steady. 8-year-olds recently lost their mother. "Yes, well," David shifted uncomfortably. "They can be challenging. Very challenging. The previous caregivers found them difficult to manage." Before Grace could respond, there was a loud crash from somewhere in the apartment, followed by what sounded like running water. David's face went pale. "Sophie! Alex!" he called out, his voice echoing through the huge space. "We're just playing!" came a sweet voice from the direction of the noise. David looked at Grace with an expression that seemed to say, "See what I mean?" Then he hurried toward the sound, and Grace followed. They found the twins in what used to be an immaculate bathroom. The bathtub was overflowing with water, and swimming around in it were at least a dozen colorful tropical fish. The expensive marble floor was covered in puddles, and both children were soaking wet trying to catch the fish with their bare hands. "Oh my God," David breathed. "Those fish cost $300 each. They're from my office aquarium." Sophie looked up at her father with wide, innocent eyes. "They looked sad in that little tank. We thought they wanted to swim in a real bathtub." Alex nodded seriously. "They needed more space to be happy." David's face was turning red, and Grace could see him struggling not to explode. This was clearly not the first time something like this had happened. "How did you even get the fish up here?" David demanded. "The service elevator," Alex said matter-of-factly. "We told the security guard we were bringing them up for cleaning." Grace watched this whole scene unfold and saw something the previous nannies probably missed. Yes, the children had caused expensive chaos, but they hadn't done it to be mean or destructive. In their 8-year-old minds, they were trying to help creatures they thought were trapped and unhappy. While David continued to panic about the fish and the water damage, Grace quietly walked to the linen closet and found some towels. She knelt down by the tub and started helping the children gently catch the fish. "You know," she said softly, "these fish are pretty smart, but they need special water to breathe properly. The water in this tub doesn't have the right nutrients for them." Sophie paused, a bright blue fish cupped in her small hands. "Really? Are we hurting them?" "Not on purpose," Grace said. "But fish are kind of like people. They need their home to feel safe and comfortable. Even if their home looks small to us, it might be exactly right for them." Alex looked worried. "We don't want to hurt them. We just thought they were lonely." Grace smiled and helped him catch a yellow fish. "That was very kind of you to think about their feelings. But sometimes when we're trying to help, we need to understand what someone really needs first." David stopped his frantic phone call to his insurance company and stared at Grace. In 5 minutes, she'd managed to get his children to voluntarily help clean up their mess, and they were actually listening to what she said. "How about we get these fish back to their proper home?" Grace suggested. "And then we can talk about other ways to help animals that might actually make them happier." The next hour was spent carefully transporting the fish back to David's office aquarium. Grace turned it into a learning experience, letting the children help measure the water temperature and count the fish to make sure they were all accounted for. David watched in amazement as his children, who usually fought every instruction and turned simple tasks into battles, followed Grace's suggestions without complaint. She didn't yell or threaten or bribe them. She just talked to them like they were actual people whose feelings mattered. "I have to leave for the airport in 2 hours," David told Grace once the fish crisis was resolved. "My flight to Tokyo can't be delayed. This business deal is worth $40 million. "We'll be fine," Grace said simply. "Won't we, kids?" Sophie and Alex looked at each other, having one of those silent twin conversations that had always made David nervous. Usually, those looks meant trouble was coming. "Are you going to leave like all the others?" Sophie asked Grace directly. The question hit Grace right in the heart. She knelt down so she was at eye level with both children. "Honey, I can't promise I'll be here forever, but I can promise that I won't leave just because you make mistakes or have bad days." Everyone makes mistakes, even grown-ups. Even you? Alex asked skeptically. Especially me, Grace laughed. Just this morning I put salt in my coffee instead of sugar. Tasted terrible, but I drank it anyway because I didn't want to waste it. The twins giggled, and David realized it was the first time he'd heard them laugh in months. I'll call every day to check in, David said, though he was really talking to Grace, not his children. And I'll be back in 4 days. Take your time, Grace said. We're going to get to know each other real well. As David gathered his luggage and headed for the door, he heard Grace asking the twins what their favorite dinner was and whether they knew how to cook anything. Their excited chatter followed him to the elevator. For the first time in months, David left his children without feeling like he was abandoning them with a stranger who would quit before he returned. Something about Grace Johnson was different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way she looked at his children like they were worth understanding instead of just managing. Or maybe it was how she didn't seem impressed by his money or intimidated by his success. Whatever it was, David found himself hoping that when he returned from Tokyo, Grace would still be there. And for the first time in 2 years, he thought she actually might be. 3 weeks had passed since Grace first walked into the Wellington penthouse, and the apartment felt different. Not just cleaner or more organized, but somehow warmer. The expensive furniture was still there, the marble floors still gleamed. But there was something new in the air. Laughter. Real laughter. Not the sharp, mean kind that usually came before trouble. Grace stood in the kitchen making pancakes while Sophie and Alex sat at the counter, flour in their hair and syrup already, sticky on their fingers. They'd been helping her cook, which really meant they'd been making a mess while she did most of the work. But Grace didn't mind. She'd learned long ago that the best conversations happened when little hands were busy. My mom used to make pancakes, shaped like animals, Sophie said quietly, drawing circles in the spilled flour with her finger. It was the first time either child had mentioned their mother without being asked. Grace kept flipping pancakes, not wanting to make a big deal out of it and scare Sophie into silence. What kind of animals? Grace asked casually. Elephants, mostly, Alex chimed in. Because they were easy, just big circles with little ears. She tried to make a giraffe once, Sophie giggled, but it looked more like a snake with bumps. Grace smiled. Sounds like she had a good sense of humor about her cooking. She wasn't very good at it, Alex admitted. Dad always said we should order pizza, but Mom said cooking together was more important than eating perfectly. The pain in his voice was clear, even though he was trying to sound casual. Grace had heard that tone before in her own children's voices after their father died. It was the sound of missing someone so much it physically hurt. Your mom sounds like a smart lady, Grace said. Want to try making elephant pancakes? I bet we can figure it out together. The next hour was spent creating increasingly ridiculous pancake shapes. They made elephants, dogs, cats, and something that might have been a dinosaur if you squinted, at it right. The kitchen looked like a flour bomb had exploded, but all 3 of them were laughing so hard their stomachs hurt. When David called for his daily check-in, Alex grabbed the phone excitedly. Dad! Grace taught us how to make elephant pancakes like Mom used to. Mine looked like a real elephant, but Sophie's looked like a blob. Did not! Sophie protested, grabbing for the phone. Mine was clearly a baby elephant. Grace watched David's face on the video call. She could see the surprise in his eyes, followed by something that looked like sadness. His children were talking about their mother without tears for the first time in 2 years. That sounds wonderful, David said, his voice a little strained. Are you both being good for Grace? Mostly, Alex said honestly. We only had one disaster. Yesterday. Grace had to hide her smile. The disaster had been Alex trying to give his stuffed animals a bath in the sink and flooding half the bathroom. But instead of screaming or calling it destructive behavior, Grace had helped him figure out which toys could actually go in water and which ones needed different kinds of cleaning. We're learning, Grace said diplomatically when David looked concerned. Every day gets a little better. After David hung up, the apartment grew quiet. Grace could tell the children were thinking about something, the way they got that look on their faces right before they asked difficult questions. Grace, Sophie said finally, do you think Dad misses Mom? The question hit Grace right in the chest. She sat down at the counter across from them, suddenly understanding why this family was struggling so much. Of course he does, honey. He loved your mom very much. Then why doesn't he ever talk about her? Alex asked. He changes the subject every time we mention her name. Grace had noticed that too. In their phone calls, David seemed uncomfortable whenever the children brought up memories of their mother. She'd seen this before with other families. Sometimes adults thought they were protecting children by not talking about painful things, not realizing they were actually making the pain worse. Sometimes, when grown-ups are very sad, they think they need to be strong for everyone else. Grace explained carefully. Your dad might think that talking about your mom will make you more upset. But we want to talk about her, Sophie said, her eyes filling with tears. We want to remember the good things, like how she used to sing us to sleep and how she always knew when we were sad, even if we didn't say anything. And how she used to dance in the kitchen while she cooked, Alex added. Even when she burned dinner. Grace's heart broke a little, more with each memory they shared. These children weren't just grieving their mother. They were grieving the loss of someone who really saw them, who paid attention to their feelings, who made them feel important and loved. You know what? Grace said, getting up from her chair. I think we should make a memory book about your mom. We can write down all the good things you remember, maybe find some pictures, and create something beautiful that's just about her. The twins looked at each other with that silent communication they shared. Grace held her breath, wondering if she'd suggested something too painful. Could we really do that? Sophie asked quietly. We could put in the recipe for her pancakes, Alex said, getting excited, and maybe draw pictures of her dancing. And write about how she smelled like vanilla and flowers, Sophie added. For the next 2 hours, Grace watched as her plan backfired in the most beautiful way possible. Instead of a quiet memory book project, the children threw themselves into remembering their mother with an intensity that was both wonderful and heartbreaking. They found photos hidden in David's desk drawer. They discovered their mother's recipe, box shoved in the back of a kitchen cabinet. They even found a video on Sophie's tablet of their mother singing Happy Birthday at their 7th birthday party. Grace sat with them as they watched the video 3 times in a row. Elena Wellington had been beautiful, with the same green eyes as her children and a laugh that filled the room. In the video, she was clearly sick, thin and pale from the treatments that hadn't worked. But her love for her children blazed through the screen. She was still trying to make us happy even when she was sick, Alex said softly. That's what moms do, Grace replied. They love their babies no matter what. Do you miss your husband? Sophie asked suddenly. Grace had mentioned being widowed, but hadn't talked about it much. Every day, Grace said honestly. But you know what I learned? Missing someone means you were lucky enough to love them. The sadness is just love with nowhere to go. Sophie crawled into Grace's lap, something she'd never done before. "I'm glad you're here. You don't try to replace Mom, but you don't pretend she never existed either." Alex joined them on the couch, and Grace found herself holding both children, while they looked through pictures of their mother. It felt like a privilege to be trusted with their memories, to be allowed into their grief. That evening, when David called for his usual check-in, he found his children creating a scrapbook at the dining room table. They were cutting out pictures and writing stories, completely absorbed in their project. "What are you working on?" he asked. "A memory book about Mom," Sophie said proudly. "Grace is helping us remember all the good things." Grace watched David's face on the screen and saw something she'd been waiting for. His carefully controlled expression cracked just a little, and for a moment she saw the grieving husband hiding behind the busy businessman. "That sounds like a wonderful project," he said quietly. "We found her recipe for chocolate chip cookies," Alex said. "The ones she made when we were sick. Grace says we can make them tomorrow." "And we found the video of her singing to us," Sophie added. "Want to see it?" David's face went pale. "Maybe when I get home," he said quickly. "I should let you get back to your project." After he hung up, Grace realized that helping the children wasn't going to be enough. Their father was just as broken as they were, just better at hiding it. And until David learned to face his own grief, this family would never be completely whole. But Grace had time, and she had patience, and most importantly, she had hope. She'd seen broken families heal before. It just took someone willing to stick around long enough to help them remember how to love each other again. The real work was just beginning. The storm hit Manhattan on a Thursday night, 3 months after Grace had first walked into the Wellington penthouse. David had been home for 2 weeks now, his business deal successfully completed, but he still felt like a stranger in his own home. The apartment was the same, but everything else had changed in ways that made him uncomfortable. His children laughed now, real, genuine laughter that echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long. They talked about their day at dinner, asked him questions about his work, and sometimes even hugged him goodnight without being asked. It should have made him happy, but instead it made him feel guilty. Why had it taken a stranger to bring joy back into his children's lives? The power went out just as David was reviewing contracts in his study. The building's generator would keep essential systems running, but the lights and most electronics were dead. In the sudden darkness, he heard Sophie scream. David rushed toward the sound, stumbling in the unfamiliar darkness. He found Sophie in her bedroom, crying under her covers. Alex was already there, trying to comfort his sister. "The thunder sounds like the car crash," Sophie sobbed. "It's too loud, just like that night." David's heart clenched. He'd forgotten that the children had been in the car when Elena died. They'd survived with minor injuries, but they'd heard everything. The screech of brakes, the impact, the terrible silence afterward. "It's just a storm, sweetheart," David said, sitting on the edge of her bed. But his voice shook, and Sophie could hear it. "You're scared too," Alex said quietly. It wasn't a question. Before, David could deny it. Grace appeared in the doorway with several candles and a calm smile. "Well, this is exciting," she said, as if losing power during a thunderstorm was the best thing that could happen. "Who wants to build a fort in the living room? A fort?" Sophie peeked out from under her blanket. "The best kind," Grace said. "The kind you build when the power's out and you have nothing else to do but be together." 20 minutes later, The living room had been transformed into a cozy cave made of couch cushions, blankets, and dining room chairs. Grace had gathered every candle in the apartment, creating a warm, flickering glow that made the storm outside seem less frightening. David sat awkwardly in the makeshift fort, unsure of his role in this impromptu family gathering. He was used to solving problems with money or connections, but you couldn't buy your way out of a power outage or negotiate with a thunderstorm. "I know," Grace said, settling down next to the children. "Let's tell stories about the happiest times we can remember." Sophie and Alex immediately looked at their father. David realized they were waiting for him to go first, and panic filled his chest. All his happiest memories included Elena, and talking about her still felt like touching a raw wound. "I don't really," David began, but Alex interrupted him. "What? About when Mom tried to surprise us with a camping trip in the backyard?" Alex said. "Remember, Dad? She set up the tent wrong and it collapsed on us in the middle of the night." David's breath caught. He did remember. Elena had been so determined to give the children an adventure without leaving the city. She'd bought an expensive tent and spent hours trying to figure out the instructions while David offered to just hire someone to set it up properly. "She was so stubborn," David said quietly, surprised to find himself smiling. "She insisted she could do it herself. And when it fell down, she just laughed," Sophie added, her fear of the storm forgotten. "She said we were having an adventure. We ended up sleeping under the stars with no tent at all," David continued, the memory becoming clearer. "Your mom made hot chocolate at 2 in the morning, and we all laid on blankets looking at the sky." "She pointed out constellations," Alex said. "But she made up her own names for them." "The giant pizza," Sophie giggled, "and the cosmic cat." "She said the real names were boring," David laughed, feeling something loosen in his chest. "She wanted to give you stars that would make you smile." Grace watched this exchange with tears in her eyes, but she stayed quiet. This was what she'd been waiting months to see. David finally talking about his wife without pain clouding every word. "What about you, Grace?" Sophie asked. "What's your happiest memory?" Grace thought for a moment. "It was right after my husband died. My kids were young, like you two, and we had no money for Christmas presents. I was so worried they'd be disappointed. But on Christmas morning, they'd made presents for each other out of things they found around the house. My daughter had written a book of silly poems for her brothers. My oldest son had carved a whistle out of a piece of wood for his sister. They'd spent weeks secretly working on these gifts, and they were so proud to give them." "That sounds better than store-bought presents," Alex said thoughtfully. "It was," Grace agreed, "because they'd put their love into making them. You can't buy love, no matter how much money you have." The words hit David like a physical blow. For 2 years, he'd been trying to buy his children's happiness. Expensive toys, private schools, fancy vacations. He'd hired people to love them because he was too scared to do it himself. Another crash of thunder shook the building, but this time nobody jumped. The fort felt safe, protected not by money or walls, but by the simple act of being together. "Dad?" Sophie said quietly. "Do you miss Mom?" The question David had been avoiding for 2 years hung in the candlelit air. Grace caught his eye and nodded encouragingly. "Every single day," David whispered, his voice breaking. "I miss her so much I can barely breathe sometimes." "Then why don't you ever talk about her?" Alex asked, his voice small and hurt. David looked. At his son, really looked at him and saw his own green eyes staring back. eyes that Elena had given to both of their children, along with her stubborn chin and her kind heart. "Because I thought if I talked about her it would make you sadder," David admitted. "I thought I was protecting you." "But we want to remember her," Sophie said, crawling closer to her father. "When we don't talk about her, it feels like she's disappearing." David's carefully built walls finally crumbled. He pulled both children into his arms and cried for the first time since Elena's funeral. He cried for the wife he'd lost, for the father he'd failed to be, and for all the time he'd wasted being afraid of his own grief. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry I left you alone with your sadness. I was supposed to take care of you, and instead I hired other people to do it because I was too scared to face how much losing your mom hurt." "We were scared too," Alex said, patting his father's back. "That's why we were mean to all those nannies. We thought if we were bad enough, you'd have to pay attention to us." Grace felt her heart break and heal at the same time. She'd seen this family's potential from the beginning, but watching them finally find each other was more beautiful than she'd imagined. The storm raged outside for 3 more hours, but inside, the blanket fort, the Wellington family was finally whole again. They talked about Elena until their voices were hoarse, sharing memories and tears and laughter. David told stories about how Elena used to dance while cooking dinner, how she always knew the right thing to say when the children were upset, and how she could find joy in the smallest moments. When the power finally came back on, nobody wanted to leave the fort. They'd found something more valuable than electricity in that darkness. They'd found each other. "Grace," David said as they finally started cleaning up the living room, "I need to ask you something important." Grace looked up from folding blankets, wondering if this was when he'd say they didn't need her anymore now that his family was healing. "Would you consider staying permanently?" David asked. "Not as a nanny or a housekeeper, but as part of our family. We need you, and I think maybe you need us too." Grace looked around the apartment that had become a home, at the children who'd become like her own, and at the man who'd finally learned how to be a father again. "I thought you'd never ask," she said with a smile that lit up the room brighter than any electric light ever could.